Salam Zoubair John. How are you doing?
Salam Kumayl John. I'm doing good, alhamdulillah. Yeah, it's good to finally be here. It took us a bit to get started. I know we got busy over the last few months with other things we were working on. The month of Ramadan came, but we're here now. Good things come to those who wait. So, inshallah, let's get
Let's do
started.
it,
Let's get
brother.
right into it.
Afghanistan. Um, so, um, I believe the best place to start would be um, last August 15th specifically. That's the infamous date that's on everybody's minds when the word Afghanistan is brought up today. So, Um, perhaps it's a good idea for us to start with a brief summary of what's actually happened in Afghanistan, what happened in August, what's happened from August till now. Um, you want to provide us a summary, Zoubair?
Sure. Yeah, let's discuss that. So basically, the way I would describe it to someone, let's say at work, when someone comes up to me and asks me where I'm from, or if I meet someone at a function or something, they'll say, "Where are you from?" And I tell them Afghanistan. They'll say, "Oh, Afghanistan. Well, how's the situation there?" Or like during those, at least during those early weeks in August, they would say, "Well, what happened?" They'll say, "What happened?" So how I would explain it is that basically the Taliban on August 15th took over Kabul specifically, which means that's the capital. And the days before that, they had taken over basically most of the other provinces, and the country has been essentially taken over by the Taliban. And the word taken over though is questionable. It's a misnomer actually. The country, the more proper way to say it would be that the country was handed over to the Taliban, because there was not much of a actual fight when they would enter each one of these provinces. When they took over Kabul, they marched right in. We'll get into that, how this was basically a conspiracy where um, the president himself fled on August 15th, and therefore the chain of command, basically telling the army and whatnot to stand down. Therefore, it was a handover essentially. But uh, what's been happening, and we saw um, during those early weeks, specifically when the U.S. pulled out their final troops on August 31st, we saw the chaos. Those scenes at the airport, um, uh, and then that that's basically the state that the country has been in ever since. It's just a state of chaos and anarchy throughout the country. There's no rule of law. It's essentially the country has been taken over by a terrorist organization. Um, and what the main takeaway is that the Taliban have not changed. If I were to tell someone, how's the situation, I'd be like, oh, you remember the Taliban in 1996 to 2001? You remember how they were? Do you remember them in the past
Mm-hmm.
20 years of their insurgency, the state of Afghanistan? That's literally it's the exact same thing. Nothing has changed in terms of governance, in terms of their like how they're ruling, the exact same way. If anything,
Mm-hmm.
it's gotten worse. In terms of like their policies and their ideology, exactly the same from the past 20 years. It's terrorist and ideology and their practices. We saw it during those first few days, those first few right when after August 15th, we saw them conducting like military parades, like celebrating, right? And in those military parades, we saw, for example, them showing off all their weapons that they used in the past 20 years, specifically suicide bombs, IEDs. Basically, they were like on the loudspeaker, and there was translations to these videos, subtitles on the bottom saying, "This is our infamous like suicide vest that we used to defeat the occupiers." When in reality, those suicide vests killed thousands upon thousands of innocent civilians and soldiers who were just defending the country, but mainly civilians. We saw, for anyone who's not aware, uh, 20 years of just, and we'll go into this, but 20 years of straight up terrorism,
Yeah.
where countless
Yeah.
civilians were
Yeah, yeah,
killed
in
by this
relation
group.
to what you just said about the military parades, I remember the first one, right? I think there was a headline.
Hmm.
Um, I read the article, and what there was a shortage. There was a shortage of fuel, of gasoline, and ambulances were not able to reach those in need. Yet this goes to show us what
Hmm.
the Taliban's priorities were. Um, and they conducted those military parades on the same day that many of the first responders were not able to reach those in need. Um, uh,
Exactly.
mhm,
Yeah, so that shows you how their priorities were put in place, definitely. And then what else was I going to say? In terms of if I was to explain someone to someone what's going on, and how the situation is, the Taliban haven't changed. We mentioned their terrorist ideology is ongoing. They One of the things that they promised to the world was they will respect human rights. Right? We clearly see that they're
mhm,
violating human rights. That's one of the main things. During those first few days, it's like right from the beginning, they didn't even attempt to to show them, to show the world, to the cameras, that like, hey, look, we got to pretend like we're different this time. No, no, no. Like, it was all over social media during those first few days, ongoing up to today. In Kabul, in the middle of like intersections, you have these Taliban soldiers in every province, but specifically the cameras where you would see it in Kabul, where they're at like an intersection, and there'd be like a woman, young girl crossing the street. Maybe her scarf wasn't fully covering her face or something like that. And when the Taliban would see her crossing, he would just be whipping her as she's walking by. These were the exact scenes that we saw in 96 to '01. We saw in different provinces, like the stonings, just the floggings for supposedly like a man, supposedly not having a beard, or on an accusation of committing adultery. Therefore, they go out and they stone a young man or woman. So these are violations of human rights, right? In the 21st century. Um, the other thing they mentioned was they promised was an inclusive government, right? And they promised inclusivity, but we saw when they announced their cabinet in, I think it was mid to late September, it was a cabinet of all men, their own men. It's not like, oh, they elected certain men from different ethnic groups and religious groups throughout the country. No, no, they specifically chose their own Taliban members, who are essentially all former Guantanamo Bay inmates, and people who are on the like FBI wanted lists with bounties on their heads. These terrorists became this government, this cabinet that they're showing to the world. And then for some reason, we have like either diplomats or the mainstream media or analysts, whatever. It's like they're all either being
whitewashing.
apologetic, or they're just making it whitewashing, right? This terrorist organization saying that, oh, they've changed. Oh, this is the reformed Taliban. We have to give them a chance. It just defies all logic, the common sense, that this has been happening. And you know one of the other things was that they promised were, that they wouldn't give
Mm,
safe haven uh, to terrorists, that they would cut off ties with terrorists, which is the most absurd thing, because it's like, you have to cut off ties with terrorists. They
mhm.
as if they're not terrorists themselves, right? It's like, oh yeah, you just blew up people for 20 years straight. You literally terrorized the country. The war on terror was against you guys, but you guys have to cut off
the
terrorists when
form
you come into power.
the
Uh,
formation the formation of
what's
a
that?
suicide brigade of their own. um so many more examples, of course, but I think that one stands out the most from
Yeah, yeah. So like they didn't end their own terrorist activities, right? We mentioned how they showed off their suicide
yeah.
vests and IEDs and stuff that killed countless civilians. But like you said, they formed like they had an official ministry, like an office, right? And they had their sign up on
Mhm.
the wall and everything. And they announced that this is our newly formed like suicide squad of our general army, our suicide unit. Um, and with that, one of the other things in relation to these suicide bombers, remember when they
Oh yeah,
paid the family members
Serena Hotel.
of suicide
Yep.
bombers? Where yeah, so yes, that's insane. It's like the people are starving. There's no jobs. There's no economy. There's no progress or anything. And what do? You go and you pay the family members of suicide bombers, saying thank you for what you've done in the past 20 years. Here's I don't know how many $100 for blowing up innocent for your son who blew up innocent civilians. So we could keep going into this stuff. We don't want to. I don't want to go into take too long on it. The other thing was the general amnesty, where they promised general amnesty. That was also fake. Supposedly, they promised to not retaliate or arrest or have revenge killings against the former government officials or the former ANDSF or security forces in the country. But we saw that that was also fake. Um, so yeah, none of this held true. They didn't hold to these phony to begin with. These promises that were absolutely um, baseless to begin with. And that's been ongoing till today. This ongoing violence that we have seen. Even the concept of saying, some might say, oh well, at least the war is over and they've brought peace. But yeah, the U.S. troops pulled out, NATO pulled out, but nothing actually. The war didn't actually end, right? Because we continuously see these suicide bombings that the Taliban themselves claimed for the past 20 years, proudly took responsibility for. Now they're coming out and like condemning it when every other week, every other day, we see a suicide bombing in mosques all over the
Mhm.
country. So that's how I would put it in a nutshell for you. That's what's been happening since August 15th
Right.
till today.
Ultimately, Taliban 2.0 being an entire, being nothing but a hoax, I'd say. Um, to elaborate just on one of the points there, I love the fact that you use the word conspiracy. Um, if someone were to ask me, what happened in Afghanistan, that's exactly where I'd start from. This whole thing, what happened in Afghanistan from last year, well, it didn't start last year. This was a conspiracy
Right.
planned. It took some years. Um, and ultimately, as you mentioned, Afghanistan's government wasn't taken over by the Taliban. They didn't have to shoot a single, fire any bullets. They didn't have to shoot any bullets, uh, kill anybody to take over. Um, I mean, on that day of the fall of Kabul, right? Yeah, yeah, yeah,
On
yeah.
that
So,
day, right, right.
this conspiracy was ultimately against Afghanistan's national defense and security forces. Um, and then just
Mm-hmm.
to expand briefly on what I mean here by you touched on this for sure, but to expand on it a little bit, is the former president Ashraf Ghani, not just him fleeing, but him along with his cronies, Hamdullah Mohib specifically being one of the uh, I'd say higher ranking amongst them. But Ashraf Ghani, Hamdullah Mohib,
Yep.
together, what they did was that they purged the entire army. They appointed inexperienced individuals in key military positions, and all of the personnel who were loyal to them surrendered their bases and districts to the Taliban. Right? A lot of people sometimes ask this question
Yeah.
of, well, wasn't why didn't the military fight back? Uh, the military was ready. They have been fighting that, and we'll get to that. Right? We'll get to that. But that's certainly
Yeah.
not the case. The people of Afghanistan have proven time and time again uh, uh, they're brave and courageous people. That was certainly not the case. If there was a strong civilian and military leadership, the Taliban would have never gained power. The this process of disintegration, it started in 2014 when an illegitimate president who committed industrial scale fraud um, was imposed on Afghanistan. um and
Yeah.
so there's absolutely there's a strong correlation between uh former president Ashraf Ghani's ascension to the presidency and instability to the country. um One of the, I believe, best examples, or uh yeah, sure, the best example of this, to illustrate this point, would be the first city to fall to the Taliban, Kunduz, happened less than a year after Ghani's inauguration. I think that says a lot, right? It speaks volumes.
Hmm.
But another aspect to it as well, and I'll conclude here, is that the what the world, especially in August and September, kept bringing up. We kept hearing the Doha talks, right? Now, what were these talks, right?
Yeah.
Um, what did they lead to? We see now. They were nothing. These Doha talks were a complete and utter disaster. A
Hmm.
biased, ethnocentrist, and even former Taliban lobbyist was appointed as the U.S.'s
Hmm.
top negotiator, and he legitimized the Taliban throughout this process. The Taliban receives so many concessions, while what do they give up? Promises. That's all we got. Promises that haven't been
Yeah.
kept. Promises from a terrorist group. That was that's the Doha talks. Uh, Essentially, Trump ignored Afghanistan and her people and allowed for Zalmay Khalilzad to make the major decisions during the negotiations. It was the Doha agreement that took the last remaining legitimacy that the Republic had, and it paved the way for the Taliban to take over the country. Um, yeah, no, that's I think we can conclude as far as a summary of events from August onwards. Um, and yeah, I remember there was a Facebook post of yours that on the 15th of August that you had shared. It was I think that post of yours had captured um, the emotions and sentiments that we were all as diaspora feeling on that day. You don't need to go ahead and read that post
Mm.
unless you want to, of course. But perhaps maybe you can expand a little bit on that part as well, because a lot of times, we hear that, well, hey, you have Afghans supporting the Taliban or things of that sort. Would you say that the average um, person from Afghanistan, um, do they support the Taliban?
No, I mean, well, yeah, I'll definitely maybe in a future episode or at some point we can discuss our like that post, for example, like I'll read that. I don't have it pulled up right now, but no, when people mention, if they ask, do the people of Afghanistan support the Taliban, I would say, well, just look into, ask the average person, but you can also look at the news. When we saw, for example, people hanging off airplanes to escape the country, that speaks for
Volumes.
itself. If it's like, right, I mean, a terrorist group, right, this the Taliban come into the country and they claim the country, they say we took over, America's out. uh, you would think that people would be celebrating, but they're rushing to the airports, hanging off airplanes to leave. We see them flooding into neighboring countries, right? Iran, for example, Pakistan, just trying to, anything to get away from the
Right.
Taliban. And that speaks for itself. But no, our own family members that live there, my entire
Mhm.
extended family lives there. Um, Not one person I would ever say that they they're happy with what's happening. So no, it's sad that they took over, and that some people have this misconception that this was a success and that this is what the people wanted, but
Yeah.
that's not
No,
true.
I think that was the best example to give to
Yep.
illustrate that, which illustrates the will and desire of the people. Of course, we haven't even mentioned, uh, and my dear sisters who are watching, please forgive us. The crimes against women specifically, right? Atrocities against women. It's Afghanistan today is the only country in the world where girls are forbidden from going to school. Uh, it's, I believe,
Correct.
either near or just over 230 days now that girls have not gone to school. Um, yeah, yeah. No, so uh,
Yeah, it's unbelievable. Women are completely erased from society when an ideology like this
all right.
comes into power.
Mhm.
This is an
Yeah, yeah, and just today,
exactly.
right? The announcement of this new veil, which we haven't seen in any
Oh yeah, yep.
Islamic country or Muslim majority country in the world, but the Taliban have introduced this covering, which is, I mean, the burqa is already covering from head to toe, right? This is like, there we go. This is part of the Taliban 2.0. If anything, they've gotten worse. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Countless examples of that. But go ahead.
No, no,
What
no.
were
I
you
was
gonna
just
say
gonna ask.
next?
Do you? We should go ahead and call that a summary of the events, right? Unless was there anything else you'd like to add?
I would. I think that that's pretty much it in terms of a general summary of what's happened from August 15th and what, till now, what's going on. Obviously, we'll go into, maybe we'll have a specific episode going into the details of the crimes and what's happening. The only other thing is obvious. Uh, the humanitarian crisis, which the Taliban have also brought
Mm-hmm.
into existence, right? Um,
Absolutely.
they basically fired everyone from their posts in terms of government, local government. They don't allow women to work at wherever they used to work at, with the exception of maybe like one spot at the airport or something like that. Right? The women are just completely banned from working, from going to school. A lot of the colleges, universities were closed. So yeah, the in doing all this, the economy just collapses, right? Um, and then when people say, they'll mention, for example, that there's a humanitarian crisis going on. Well, if the Taliban had just act like a a normal government, right? If they just allow human rights, right? Or it's something as simple as just allow the girls to go to school. Well, maybe the international community will recognize you guys as a legitimate government, and therefore there will be more trade and aid coming in, and stuff like that. But even the aid that has come in, we've seen there's been articles written on this. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. I remember that they cited that the Taliban have been taking that aid and giving it to their own
Yeah, yeah,
fighters. They're not giving it to the people. My own family actually attested to this. They said um, there's aid coming in by these NGOs, and the people will like go to this place supposedly where they're handing out aid, and there'll be like a Taliban commander there telling people to go away, telling people to like go away, and they're just giving it, they're just taking it and putting it
right.
into their own cars and going
And
off. This
where
there's
in
multiple
Afghanistan is
accounts
that?
of this.
Mazar
This
Sharif.
is in Mazar
Yeah,
Sharif in the
ironically,
north. Yeah.
I have a similar story to that, and it's not my own family, but there's this university professor who's in Paktia. He shared this with me. I believe it was in October or so. Um, and they saw trucks coming in with aid. You know, the Taliban had received some of that new deliveries, and even in
Hmm.
Paktia, uh, they were only distributing this aid to their own forces, literally their own forces, and those who supported them received aid, and that's how the decision to on who to distribute aid to was being made. So yeah, the humanitarian crisis, of
Mm.
course, but we have multiple crises, and this is just a part of it. But I absolutely agree. We should actually have an entire episode going into all of the atrocities. Oh, before I forget, I noted this down here. I think one of the very or important ones that we should mention, even in our summary here, is the genocide. Um, Historically, Hazara people have faced genocide after genocide in Afghanistan, but uh, the revival of this genocide, or the continuation of this genocide, I should rather say, um, is
Hmm.
happening now
Hmm.
as we speak. How many Hazara mosques, because due to them being primarily Shia Muslims, have been bombed? On which day? The holiest days where Muslims are obligated to pray at their mosques. There were multiple Fridays since August till now where there were blasts at these mosques, right?
Hmm.
So the
Right.
targeting of the specific ethnic group, and the forced displacements that have been taking place, that's a big one as well. I think we should certainly include on this episode. Um, yeah. So
Absolutely.
if go ahead.
But no, I was just gonna say. So, since we described these things that have been happening, obviously this all has to do with the Taliban who are in power. Um, would you mind actually maybe if you could give us a brief,
Yeah.
like a summary on the Taliban in terms of like who they are, like how they came into
No, sure.
existence?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I asked the dear viewers and yourself to bear with me a little bit because to truly understand who this group is, of course, we have to delve into their history, understand where they came from, why uh, they were formed. Um, and so, where we kind of have to start from is from the 1970s. Um, in the 70s, um, an individual by the name of Dawood Khan. Well, first of all, let me mention this, that there was a monarchy in place in Afghanistan during the time. But Dawood Khan, the cousin of the king, he overthrew the monarchy of the time, in place, established his very own uh, autocratic. Nah, it was a dictatorship. With the help of the communists, he established this dictatorship, and yeah, so that's the first thing. um, I think as far as providing context, that must be noted. Now what happened was, after that, was that this created reactionary forces within society, who were traditionalists, such as the honorable and great commander Masood, and it also uh, created radicals like Gulbuddin Hikmatyar, and there were plenty of others as well. But so yeah, during this time, Pakistan realized that it was the perfect opportunity to secure their national interests in Afghanistan by training the one who I just mentioned, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, and then the other being Jalaluddin Haqqani, who's the father of the infamous Sirajuddin Haqqani, representing today's Taliban. Um, yeah, so
Hmm.
I'm going to move a little bit faster through this part of history. We'll fast forward through the whole Soviet um, uh,
Fast
invasion
forward.
and all of that. We'll for sure come back to it and cover it and go more in depth into it in future episodes. But yeah, so that was the climate in the 70s, and then 80s. We're getting to that time. So when the communist government started uh, but I guess okay, this has to be mentioned. Then we'll do a little bit more of the fast forwarding. But when the communist government started disintegrating, uh, and a peaceful transfer of
Hmm.
power um, happened from the commies to a group of freedom fighters known as the Mujahideen, um, led by Commander Masood. Uh, One individual, because of Pakistan's interests, stood up against an entire consensus. Um, what this individual, Gulbuddin Hikmatyar, did is he prevented lasting peace from being established. All of the parties reached a consensus over Afghanistan's future, and it was Sibqatullah Mujaddidi who became interim president, while Hikmatyar himself was appointed as prime minister. Now, what did he do? He's the first prime minister, perhaps the only prime minister, actually, certainly the only prime minister in history to bombard his own capital for the interests of another country. How ridiculous is that?
Hmm.
Um, yeah, no. So, one thing like to note here as well. We'll get into we'll go more in depth into these personalities, who they were, and their biographies. But one thing to mention about
Yeah.
Commander Masood never fought for power or for wealth or for anything of that sort. And it was for this reason that he didn't place himself in a position, any in a leadership position when he and his forces had liberated Kabul in '92, and allowed an individual from another party to lead the interim government. Right? Um, I believe it was Professor Thomas Barfield who had said that if Masood would have decided different, something, I'm paraphrasing his words, but if Masood would have decided differently in '92, Afghanistan's history would have been different today. A remarkable point
Hmm.
that I think everyone should reflect on for sure. And what's clearly meant here is that if he took upon any leadership position instead, he would have managed the situation much better than anyone else could, and would have, and he would have sustained peace and stability in the country. So yeah, so we're in the '90s now, right? And by 1994, um, um, by '94 he was defeated, um, and Pakistan realized this investment is futile and it won't go anywhere. Their investment in Hikmatyar,
Well.
which was their plan A.
Okay.
Let's phrase it as their plan A, right? Um, and so as that failed, right? As a result, they resorted to their plan B, which was to mobilize uh, the the young students, the young students who were radicalized
Mhm.
back in the 80s in Pakistani madrasas. Okay. Um, and in fact, this is where they actually get their name from, right? The Taliban, a literal translation of them would be student, or what would be more proper would be religious students, right? Um, so yeah,
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
that's okay. So that was from up until 94, and then from 94 to 96, uh, they put up an effort with the support of Pakistan to take over Kabul, the capital city. Um, Yet
Yeah.
Commander Massoud, who was commanding forces to defend and protect Kabul and her people, um, so
Mhm.
he was able to prevent them from entering the capital city, and they were forced to withdraw these students, the Taliban, to Kandahar on more than one occasion. Okay, that Kandahar was their was where they retreated to and withdrew to on more than one occasion. Right. Um, Despite all of this, Commander Massoud, he believed in peace. He prioritized it. He displayed his willingness to sacrifice everything and anything for the sake of peace. And perhaps the best example of this is when he went to Maidan Shahr in Wardak province, to meet the Taliban, to extend an olive branch. He went with no bodyguard, unarmed, right? Um, of course,
Mhm.
though, as peace was not on the Taliban's agenda, um, that was a certainty, and rather they lacked the will and the intention to bring peace, um, and their sole aim was total domination in a struggle for more power. So that's a little bit of the history. Oh, sorry, I do want to mention this one final point, and then we'll wrap it up over here as far as Taliban and their roots and all. But in 1996, so until 94, there was no such thing as the Taliban, right? We had some radical Islamist extremists, but there was no such thing as, or the term the Taliban was never coined or framed until 94.
Mhm.
But then 2 years later in 96, with the help of um, U.S. lobbyists, UNOCAL, Khalid Azad, as we mentioned, and some other diplomats, even some diplomats in the State Department, the Taliban received aid and assistance, and they started advancing towards Kabul again. They took the city in 96. Um, and it wasn't like Commander Massoud wasn't capable of taking back the city, but as I mentioned earlier, this guy, at while being prime minister, right, starts a bloodbath and bombards the capital city, and he was entirely capable of putting up a strong resistance in Kabul, just how he had done when Hekmatyar was bombarding the capital, but he didn't want the people suffering any longer, as they had already suffered enough, and so he withdrew to the north, and from 96 onwards, he led the national resistance without any sort of foreign aid, and he put up a strong fight against the Taliban and prevented them, despite all the support they were receiving, to take over the nation. Um, I think that pretty much wraps up, uh, for now, at least. We'll go more into detail as we've mentioned plenty already, into the figures, the names that we've mentioned, into their past and history, um, and
Yeah.
all of that for sure. So yeah, this was, yeah, like I said, from we covered up until 96 as far as history is concerned. Uh, I think from here, um, post 1996. to 2001, while the Taliban were in power. We'll certainly cover Taliban 1.0, right? We can do an entire episode on that, but um, perhaps it's a better idea. Maybe let's delve into the war on terror, right? Um, I'm sorry, I
Yeah.
didn't even ask you, Zoubair. Did you have anything to add to uh, as far as the Taliban
No,
and
no,
their roots?
that was definitely a concise summary. Because like, what was it, in like 10 minutes that you basically summarized that. We could have an entire episode, lectures on this, right? There's books written about this. So the only thing that I guess, since you told me to, we could get into the war on terror. Uh, what we can mention is what led up to that, right? So obviously, we had the Taliban government from '96 to 2001. As that was happening, they were, um, the country was in a complete state of darkness, right? They were, uh, we all know about the brutalities and the the rule of law, their harsh rule. We don't have to get into all of that, but what they were doing in the process was that they were allying themselves, right, with terrorist groups, specifically Al Qaeda. Um, Osama bin Laden was in the country, and they were sheltering him basically. And Al Qaeda had set up training camps alongside the Taliban throughout these 5 years. So Ahmad Shah Massoud, that you mentioned, Commander Massoud, was fighting the Taliban and Al Qaeda throughout these 5 years. There were certain areas of the country that were strongholds of the resistance. But unfortunately, what led to, before the we get into the war on terror, 2 days before September 11th, two journalists, or they were undercover, they were pretending to be journalists. Um, they wanted to interview Ahmad Shah Massoud. They sit down with him, and they were actually suicide bombers. They had hidden a bomb in a camera, and they blew themselves up. They blew up the camera, and for just unfortunately, Ahmad Shah Massoud was killed in that attack. And 2 days later, September 11th happens. Um, September 11th was the catalyst, what started this entire war on terror. But
If only the
what's
world
interesting,
listened to Commander Massoud.
yeah, exactly, exactly. I was just about to mention that. Unless you want to
No, no, go ahead.
elaborate on
No,
that.
no. Huh.
Yeah. So basically, Ahmad Shah Massoud had mentioned uh, a few times, but the most recent one was a few months before September 11th, that he warned the world basically that if the international community, but specifically he was speaking to Bush at the, I think it was a conference in the European Union.
I think
He
it was
had
the
he
EU Parliament.
Yep.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, and his message was um, to the world basically that if the Taliban are not uh, taken care of, it, if you do not assist us in combating the Taliban, that they will not only be a problem for Afghanistan, for the people of Afghanistan, but they will also cause damage to the world. Meaning that, like, they have he had intelligence that they were planning attacks on the West. And of course, a few months after he was assassinated, 2 days later, 9/11 happens. So 9/11 basically, um, we see 3,000 people almost killed in the United States, the biggest attack, terrorist attack in history. And what what happened was that the United States asked the Taliban, right, who was the government of Afghanistan at the time, to give up the ringleader, the mastermind of um, this terrorist attack. And the Taliban basically, they said no. They said there's no evidence that he committed this attack. We don't give up our guests. We treat them as guests, and we will not give them up. So sometimes, people criticize this war on terror, and by all means, but what people don't understand is that it was the Taliban who brought the international community into Afghanistan. It was them that initiated this war. Had they just given up bin Laden, this war would never have happened, right? So of course the U.S. invades and NATO comes into, and to fast forward, we have a 20-year uh, this war on terror, 20 years of NATO and America combating the Taliban and Al Qaeda. Um, and then we have this insurgency. Basically, Pakistan, what you mentioned earlier, where they had gone to, they had a plan A and then they had a plan B, right? They go back to
Right.
their original proxy, which was the Taliban, right? They invest in them again, which prolongs this war.
Right.
We see that the Taliban uh, attacking civilians in on a daily basis, right? In their suicide bombings and IEDs, roadside bombs. And the last 20 years was essentially just instability caused by the Taliban. Uh, and at the same time, the corruption, right? We have to mention the corruption of the government, the Afghan government, by initiated by President Karzai and Ashraf Ghani. We could go into details, but we don't want to
Yeah,
take.
well, the whole
Well,
institution and the whole system that deserves its own episode for sure.
exactly.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
really difficult to summarize everything into just a couple of minutes, since this initial episode is a general summary. But fast forward 20 years of terrorist attacks, corruption, incompetency, led back to square one, where the Taliban are now back in power. That's as concise as I could put it for you.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great summary. And that kind of leads us up to radio resistance. Why are we called radio resistance? Right.
Yeah.
Um, History repeats itself, uh, as that saying goes. Right. Um, but while most of the world was fooled into believing there's a Taliban 2.0, um, that certainly, I mean, uh, today's episode hopefully has shed some more light on that matter for
Hmm.
everybody. But the resistance, yes, there is a 2.0. Um, on August 15th, we mentioned everything in light of from the perspective of the Taliban being handed power and all of that, right? But uh, and of course we mentioned how everyone lost hope, right? So when this happened, when everyone lost hope and they succumbed to the situation, the political class, including again as we mentioned the president, they fled and went into
Hmm.
exile that same day. Everybody flees, right? People weren't able to see any future any longer. They started to rush towards the airport, but one man with a historic decision changed the course of history in Afghanistan. He made this choice to stay in his country, to give hope to his people that there's a better tomorrow. And he declared that even if he is left entirely alone, he will stand up and resist and not stop resisting. Uh, Resultantly, he boarded a helicopter while all others fled the nation. He boarded a helicopter from capital city Kabul to Panjshir, and from there he formed the National Resistance Front of Afghanistan. And this was with the remnants of the nation's armed forces, what was left from the ANDSF. And ever since then till now, there's been more and more of the ANDSF making their way to that's quote unquote the central command or headquarters for the NRF of Afghanistan. Um, Zoubair, I think that covers it for as far as summaries are concerned. Um, was there anything you'd like to add as far as the resistance and uh, the NRF specifically?
Yeah, the only thing I guess this definitely deserves an episode of its own, of course. But radio resistance, the whole premise of it is what the name resistance, right? When we speak about the National Resistance Front, right, the NRF, I think the world needs to understand one thing that they don't people don't know is that there is a people who are resisting against the Taliban. As you mentioned, Ahmad Massoud is the leader. He goes into Panjshir and he starts this resistance movement. And till today, from since the end of August till today, the NRF has been fighting, not just in Panjshir, but now we've seen the resistance rise up in several other provinces as well. We see it in Andarab, we see it in some of the northern provinces in Badakhshan, and in the last few days, we've seen significant victories where districts are being taken back, local districts within provinces are being taken back, and this is really significant because these are the people of the country that are from the local towns and villages. Some of them
Right.
are people who, their ancestors or whether their fathers, right, or even some who are young enough then, they're currently picking up arms and fighting right now. So I think it's important to note that if the people of Afghanistan were able to defeat the Soviet Union in the 1980s, it's they're more than capable of defeating this terrorist group today. So we'll go into specific stories and a specific episode dedicated to the NRF in regards to um, who they are and what their mission is. But the mission of the NRF should also be noted in this episode that they are a group that is dedicated to moderation in all things, right? A moderate interpretation of Islam, which is the real Islam, right? Islam is meant to be a religion of moderation. Um, a moderate, uh, in terms of a middle way, right? Democratic rights, respecting human rights, respecting the rights of women, including them in society and government, in terms of education. This is a progressive, a forward moving, uh, basically ideology that it needs to exist in in any society, but specifically in the 21st century. So this is something that the people of Afghanistan are behind, that they approve of, and I think Ahmad Massoud is the embodiment of uh, a leader that knows what he's doing in terms of leading a moderate movement for the people of Afghanistan. And I think we'll definitely go into specific episodes on different issues that uh, need to be discussed, right? In terms of misconceptions, in terms of history, right, and in terms of future plans, in terms of what the NRF stands for, what this resistance stands for. Um, but that's all I wanted to add. And go ahead if you had any closing remarks, then we can definitely wrap this up.
Yeah, no, yeah, we
Hmm.
are reaching the hour mark in a few minutes. So yeah, we should definitely should conclude. No, I'm very glad you brought up uh, were expanded on the objectives of the NRF. That's something very important as well. So when His Excellency Ahmed Massoud uh, went from Kabul to Panjshir and formed the National Resistance Front of Afghanistan, and as you just mentioned, the values which they stand for. Uh, as I'm taking this directly from them as far as their platform is concerned. Ahmad Massoud, and this isn't something the at least from the first part of it is not something that just came out of nowhere or the leader Ahmad Massoud has been working on this plan and this platform for at least the last 4 or 5 years. But the essential principles of the National Resistance Front, uh, I would put him in four
Yes. What
top
are
level
those?
categories:
Yes. Very
decentralization,
important.
uh, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
decentralized system of governance, counterterrorism, um, social and
Mm-hmm.
economic justice, and finally, women's rights.
Human rights. Yep.
Women's rights and human rights. These would be, I believe, the essential principles of the National Resistance Front. Um, and one can clearly see this from uh, uh, observing and watching any of the actual seeing any of the statements from any of the NRF officials, especially that of the founder and
Yeah. One
leader
other
of
thing,
this
just before we
movement.
wrap up, for those who don't know, Ahmed Massoud is the son of the national hero of Afghanistan, Ahmed Shah Massoud. You guys might have noticed right over there. We have his picture. That's Ahmed Shah Massoud. I think you're wearing his shirt. Who's that on your shirt, Kumail Jan? That's that's the
No, that's
that's
Ahmad
right.
Massoud. Yep, Ahmad
So
Massoud, the
this
freedom.
is this young man was in he could have been overseas living a normal life, right, in terms of whatever, pursuing education and having an actual like a full-time job that the rest of the world has. But he decided to come into his country and defend his people the same way his father did. So this is an honorable and a very this is a movement and a decision that deserves all the respect in the world. And I hope you know the world will recognize this and support this man and support this movement, because this is the only shot that Afghanistan has in defeating this terrorist ideology and bringing freedom to the people of Afghanistan who rightfully deserve
Yeah,
their rights and their freedom.
right, right. Yeah, as MLK has mentioned or has said, injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere, and therefore it's a human responsibility of everybody and anybody around the world to today stand with the National Resistance Front of Afghanistan, and which is essentially standing with the abandoned um, former National Defense and Security Forces of Afghanistan. Um, yeah, again, we're 1 minute away from it being an entire hour, which is fine. But I earlier you mentioned that part of the purpose of our podcast, right? Um, uh, as far as closing remarks on my end, I'd like to just mention exactly as you said. Shedding light on those misnomers, those misconceptions, those misunderstandings, um, spreading awareness, exposing those lies and those misconceptions, and ultimately, the purpose of our podcast here is to provide the voiceless people of Afghanistan a platform and give these
Yep,
voiceless
couldn't have
people
said
a
it better
voice.
myself. Yeah, I
Um,
think I think that should be it. And unless you have anything else, I think we can.
No, no. I thank everybody who has joined us for tuning in today. This was the first of many episodes to come. Please, if you did enjoy today's episode, do not forget to hit the subscribe button. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're available on Spotify, Apple, and YouTube for now. So thank you guys.
No, thank you all
Zoubair, if
for
you had any
tuning
closing
in, and
remarks.
we hope to be with you on the next episode.